Sorry. Okay, welcome back after what I hope was a lovely lunch. I introduced the chair of the following session. This is Janet Melba-Weisman. Dr. Janet Melba-Weisman is a principal lecturer in social work with a particular is that right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. With a particular interest in gender, sexuality, and also more specifically, she's interested. Did a lot of interesting work around sexual abuse of vulnerable people, institutional sexual abuse of vulnerable people, and also about reconciling faith-based organizations with sexuality. So these are two really interesting areas of her field, and she will chair the whole double session this afternoon with a break in between. So I gave her a lot of work. Thank you so much, Janet.
Yes, thank you, Björn. I was very pleased to be invited to chair the panel this afternoon, particularly as the theme is narratives and theories, but I think also, I mean, my mind has been kind of buzzing really with a lot of ideas and thoughts from the sessions we've already had this morning, from thinking about how we teach social work students about variability in terms of the mind as well as the body in relation to mental health issues and so on. So it's been a very rich experience for me so far. The theme this afternoon, narratives and theories, again is kind of linked with how some of our understanding of these issues can actually have a real life impact on the lives of individuals, particularly individuals who are rendered additionally vulnerable, as well as their experience of social inequalities and so on in contemporary society. Without further ado, though, I'd like to introduce Matthew Ball, who's joining us. He's senior lecturer in the School of Justice at the Queensland University of Technologies in Brisbane. So he's joining us at 11:30 at night from Brisbane, and it's the first time I've chaired anything where we're reliant on technology, but so far it's working fantastically. I know that you were asked to move to the centre so that Matthew could see as many people as possible. It wasn't a political statement, but you might need to move even further to the centre when we get to the questions afterwards so that Matthew can see you all. But we'll take questions after this first session, and then after that I'll introduce the next speaker. So technology is working. Matthew, over to you.
Fingers crossed. Thank you very much for that introduction, Janet, and thank you for accommodating this kind of delivery of the format. I did hope to be there with you, but some recent family issues have prevented that from happening. So please bear with the Skyping in the conference. It's the first time I've done anything like this as well. Over the last couple of years, what I've been doing has been research that has been trying to draw queer theories and queer studies, queer ideas, and criminology together, and that's kind of a weird kind of mix. And I want to acknowledge Nick Groombridge. I don't know whether Nick is there. I know he's attending one of the other sessions during the conference, because his work has really been one of the original works right back in 1999 that started to ask these sorts of questions. And what I want to do today is provide a kind of reflection on some of the ethics of queer in criminology, hence the title of the presentation. And I want to do this because I think that some of these questions, some sort of ethical reflection on what queer criminology is, what queer criminology does, or the task of queering in criminology, some of those questions haven't been asked, haven't really been explored too much in the field so far. Just by way of a bit of a background in terms of what queer work in criminology is, it's an area that has tried to do a number of different things at once. So it's really sort of started from this notion that criminology and criminal justice studies have either been very problematic in the context of engaging with queer communities and engaging with queer experiences of the criminal justice system, which is, tends to be quite an injurious, problematic institution. So what queer criminology seeks to do is try to address those sorts of oversights, the blind spots of criminology, and also to move beyond this notion of queer lives as deviant, which has dominated criminology and criminal justice studies for quite a while, up until the last few decades. And it's also an attempt to address some of those historical injustices that sort of continue today. In the process, what criminologists have done is turn to some extent to queer theories and concepts and ideas to try and get some sort of conceptual and methodological and theoretical tools to help develop the area. And some have drawn in very diverse ways from queer scholarship in doing that. So some have tried to use queer scholarship to try to account for the complexity of subjectivity, in queer lives, to recognise the fluidity that queer can signify. Others have taken from queer work a kind of ethos of queering, of critique, of deconstruction and what have you, and actually trying to encourage people to reflect on the tasks of criminology differently and the stakes of criminological work, which is something that my work is, I try to contribute to those kinds of streams within the field. And also, there are others who have simply taken from queer work the notion of queer, the term queer as a catch-all umbrella category for, an assortment of sexuality and gender diverse groups and communities. And when they do that, what they've done is generally undertaken what we consider sort of traditional criminological studies of trying to understand the causes and effects of crime, what have you, and administrative tasks of trying to respond to, as part of the criminal justice system. And so they've sort of attached the term queer to what are conventional kind of criminological research and critiques. So anyway, in this context, some of the key debates that probably have occurred within other bodies of scholarship for quite a while about the value of queer and how to deploy the term, what it can mean and what it can do. Those debates that are well worn in other disciplines are relatively new in criminology. So it's only now that queer criminologists are starting to consider, does the queering of criminology require just the greater inclusion of queer communities within criminological thought? Does it require a sort of disruptive troubling of criminology itself? And are there other possibilities within the notion of queer that ought to inform the directions that it pursues? And I think these questions are very important, and they lend themselves to a number of sort of ethical reflections on the key directions of the field. And I think that I frame them as ethical questions, partly in line with the theme of the conference as well, but also because the answers to them and what we sort of make of queer work within criminology carry with them very significant effects. And key among those effects is the shaping of the experiences of members of queer communities who still experience the severest sort of end of the justice system, who experience the sort of blunt end of the justice system. So in this kind of process, in thinking about these things as ethical debates and tasks, I want to contribute to that aspect of outlining some of the directions of queer criminological work, and also I have a particular view of what ethics might be in this sort of sense, and I really view it drawing inspiration from Judith Butler's work about the notion of livable lives and of lives that matter that she's developed in some of her recent work, and as I said, I was sort of inspired by those sorts of ideas, because I think that's an important way of thinking about these issues. So what I want to do today with this presentation is look at one key example of a recent event that occurred in San Francisco last year during the Pride celebrations, which was a prison-themed party. It was called Prison of Love Party. And it was hosted by fetish pornography website kink.com. And the hosting of this party led to quite considerable controversy within a range of communities, a range of queer communities. And I think this opens up, it gives us a way of starting to think about the stakes of queer criminological work and the ethical stakes and the stakes politically of queer criminological work as well. The controversy around the party was quite interesting. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a moment. But really, as I said, I want to suggest that the party itself highlights a number of key issues that confront queer criminology, and it allows us to explore whether it's what the possibilities are, what the problems are of investing in institutions such as the criminal justice system, and such as the police, and even criminology itself as a discipline that contributes to administration and regulation, what have you. So in doing that, what I'm going to be doing is considering the community debate that sort of surrounded this party. So can I get you to change the slide, John?
Yeah, John.
Done.
Fantastic, thank you. So just to give you a bit of background about the party, as I said, it was hosted by kink.com during the Pride celebrations in San Francisco last year. The quotes on that slide are some of the quotes from the advertising material about the party. It was so I'll leave you to read some of those yourself. There's an image in the bottom left corner of that slide as well. That was a still from a video that was made, produced by the organisers, which was a company called WE Entertainment or something like that, that specialised in themed dance parties. So there was a lot of big production values. That video was basically involved some of the performers from kink.com in the roles of prisoner and prison guard, and it included striptease and dancing and what I can only describe as a suggestive manipulation of a baton by the police officer. And it's sort of not a surprise that this theme for this party met with quite vocal criticism from some members of the LGBTI communities. I'm not going to go into all of it, but if I can get you to change to the next slide, please, John. Done. Thanks. A number of organisations within San Francisco who support sex workers, who support transgender people, people of colour, and legal organisations who are dealing every day at the coalface of the sort of pointy end of the justice system, penned an open letter, and these are some quotes from that letter. And what they're basically doing in that in that letter is saying that the tropes of the criminal justice system, the prison industrial complex, incarceration, mass imprisonment, war on drugs, and all of these important issues are not really things that should be thrown around as party themes, because they have such a significant impact on very marginalised members of communities. So I think what's sort of really telling is one of those quotes there. They say, as individuals and organisations committed to justice and equality, we are working to end violence in our communities, and particularly at the hands of law enforcement, jails, detention centres and prisons. We've been doing this for years, and we'll be supporting our brothers, sisters and siblings behind prison walls while you're hosting a sex and dance event that trivialises themes of incarceration and abuse as a good time. So that was quite a sort of severe reaction to that, taken very seriously and saying we shouldn't really be trivialising or joking about any of these issues. These are very serious things. On the other hand, can I get you to do the next slide, please, John? The owner of the Armoury and Kink.com and one of the organisers of the party, Peter Ackworth, he responded with his own open letter to the community outrage that was sort of developing, and it's quite a long letter, but and I'll come back to this later on. But he does note that in his defence and in the defence of those who wanted to attend the party and to host the party, he said this is fundamentally a matter of freedom of expression. He believes that his kink should be okay, and if a group wants to organise a party, they should be free to do so without shame. The purpose of the event was a celebration, and it wasn't meant to trivialise or normalise any horrible things. And he talks a little bit more about the dynamics of sexual fantasy and the politics of sexual fantasy, and how he saw them playing out in that context. So ultimately, all of this came to a head on the night of the party. If I can get you to go to the next slide, please, John. There was a protest organised by a number of community groups, including Gay Shame, which is a very active activist group in San Francisco particularly, attended by a couple of hundred people. So those are some of the images from that protest. And they were shouting slogans. They had banners that you can see there. They were projecting images and text onto the building as well, pointing out some of the problems with the justice system and what have you. And ultimately it ended in violence. 7 of the protesters were arrested and eventually released a few days later. But this only reinforced for them their critique that some of the benefits of progressive politics that have sought to extend the protection of the justice system towards members of the queer community have only benefited a small number of people. So they saw this, the fact that the police came to the party and that some of the protesters were arrested was really demonstrating this division, these homonormative kind of dynamics within the community. So with that as the background, what I want to ask is, what should we make of this? And I think what it does is really bring to light some key ethical issues, as I said. It draws attention to on one hand, to the fact that those kinds of progressive gains have not been shared equally by all. So it's understandable that people can level critiques about celebrating one's pride through overtly using the tools and referencing the tools that marginalise and oppress others. You can understand that as a critique. But at the same time, there is something to be said about the fact that the party is an expression of sexuality, as indeed most pride celebrations are, and something that itself exemplifies queer subversion and that sort of politics as well. And I think all we need to do is consider the existence of criminal justice motifs in particularly gay male cultural production for a very long time, and the desire within, in doing that, to re-signify those cultural tropes and institutions of heteromasculinity, and try and get those people to recognise the queer within those kinds of those dynamics and those motifs and those institutions, what have you, and those symbols. And also, I think it's we can't really possibly know the political motivations of everyone who attended the party. So some of them may have understood it as a subversive political act as well. So what I think, it's actually difficult as a queer criminologist reflecting on this as an issue that brings up a whole range of different possible political positions. It's very difficult to come down on either side, so to speak, of that divide. I think it's actually much more productive to look at what both positions produce and what they make possible. And it's sort of here where I draw inspiration from Judith Butler's work on lives that matter and are made livable. And because what she does is point to the fact that particular discourses, particularly discursive scenes of recognition and frames of recognition, allow for some possibilities, some lives, some, and you could extend this to some sexual fantasies, some particular sexual politics and what have you, can be recognised and considered as more possible than others. So it's that sort of dynamic that I'm interested in here. And that's why I'd suggest that as queer criminologists we can take or recognise a range of different responses to the party and extend the range of views about what kind of connection to criminal justice institutions we might want to foster. Of course, when I'm referring to notions of livable lives and what have you here, I want to recognise that Judith Butler's work focuses on trans people, people with HIV, those in the Middle East, so whose existence is threatened very constantly in a very real way in most of the work that she's done on that. So I don't want to overstate that at all, but that's exactly what the people who are protesting the party are trying to point out, the fact that these criminal justice institutions do have a very significant and very immediate, pose an immediate threat to the lives of some within queer communities. I'm not suggesting that everyone in that context experiences the same risks to their lives in that sense. So, for example, those who could afford to pay the $75 American to attend the party, are obviously clearly in a very privileged position, so they're unlikely to experience their lives as significantly less livable if they can't attend that party. But it's interesting within the debates that ensued, some lives, some tastes, and some personal views seem to become less speakable and less possible, and that's the case on both, on people taking sort of each side of the debate. So I just want to give some examples of that just to illustrate what am I all right for time?
Yes, Matthew, it's fine.
Fantastic. So first, if we consider those who were protesting the party, obviously they were protesting because of the high rates of police brutality, of mass incarceration, other injustices and what have you. And there was some variety to those critiques. The original letter of protest actually recognised that complexity. If I can get you to go to the next slide, please, John. The first two dot points on that slide are quotes from the original letter of protest. And what I think is interesting about this is that they're sort of anticipating the critique that people might have of their critique of the party, if that makes sense. So they're trying to say it's not that we don't love sex parties, sex workers and kink. It's that we love it as much as we love justice and are appalled by the casual use of the prison industrial complex, which destroys the lives of millions of people and kills thousands every year as a party theme. And they also say, what we're interested in is not shaming anyone for fantasies and what have you, but we're interested in ensuring public space and party themes move us all closer to liberation and don't normalise and reproduce the oppression that we experience. So at least that position sort of acknowledges the legitimacy of alternative views on that matter. And it suggests that these political goals seeking to ensure safety and greater social justice for some are actually more important than potentially people's rights to what they talk about in those quotes as fantasies, fetishes, and sex lives. So they're sort of positioning those as less important and potentially less politically charged than others. The other quotes on that slide come from a queer performance artist, Anthony Julius Williams, who provided a bit of commentary about the party as well. And yeah, he's pointing out very clearly in one of those quotes the way in which these sorts of disadvantages sort of compound each other. So he says, first, rich white people push us out of our neighbourhoods, then they arrest us for the resulting homelessness, mental illness, drug abuse and violence, then they jack off to it at a sex party. Welcome to white supremacy, San Francisco style. So again, he's pointing to those serious dynamics of injustice. They can be contrasted to those who supported the party, or those who said that regardless of whether I support the party or not, it's still, the partygoers ought to still have the right to have the party if they want to. If I can go to the next slide, please, John. So what they were saying, so this is an extension of Peter Ackworth's original letter, his response to that first open letter that was sent in protest of the party. And in that quote where he's saying, I asked you to consider the fact that sexual fantasy and BDSM have long been tools used by those experiencing real-life trauma and oppression to reclaim that imagery. And so effectively what he's doing there is pointing to the importance of this as a queer political kind of act. This party is a queer political kind of act. And he says that people who are engaging in that are doing so understanding that it's queering the representation of these symbols and reclaiming those symbols of oppression in order to trivialise the authority of the oppressor. What was really interesting on this side of the debate was that other community members supported the party, not really referring to the dynamics of BDSM and fantasy and politics there, but they simply saw it as an opportunity for freedom of speech and freedom of expression, or an outlet for freedom of expression. And from that perspective, they were sort of arguing that anyone who protested the party appeared to be attempting to restrict that kind of freedom. So as one of the commentators said, instead of turning on each other, we should all join forces and fight for all our rights. If the Prison of Love party had been shut down, it would have been set another precedent for censorship, and that would be a problem for all. So I think in this example, you sort of get a real sense that the ability to express oneself, even along the lines of the fantasies that others might find uncomfortable and problematic, is central to some element of being able to live a queer life, at least as understood by those who wanted to attend the party. And they actually didn't seem to expect they might get that kind of critique from others within the queer community. So to sort of bring this to a close, what I'm sort of suggesting here, what I see here, is different ethical positions on these matters that I think can actually inform big picture questions about queer criminology. Because those who were protesting the party were effectively extending an existing queer critique of notions of homonormativity, of the continuing exclusions within with progressive gains, or produced by progressive gains, and the continual marginalisation of some within queer communities. And so for them, the most ethical approach, the most ethical direction to follow is one that doesn't support any sort of further investment in those institutions, or further extension of those institutions, and doesn't attempt to disregard the marginalisation experienced by those who are marginalised by that. So what I'd argue that they're trying to do there is to ensure that the conditions that render the lives of some of the most disadvantaged members of queer communities less livable are not perpetuated. At the same time, though, those who supported the party also expressed effectively what we could understand as ethical positions that they sought to foster. So by suggesting that it go ahead on the grounds of freedom of speech, sexual expression, and because it allowed a political reformulation of power relations, they implied that closing down on those possibilities would make some queer lives more difficult to live. That it would be an unwarranted restriction on freedom of sexual expression, and it would limit the ability for some members of queer communities to explore their fantasies, to exist sexually, I suppose. So they also argued that we ought not easily dismiss the dynamics of BDSM and kink in that context, because they're important political tools for queers to re-signify and queer the institutions and relations that have constantly had a negative impact on many queer lives. In effect, what we could see is that this is sort of suggesting an ethical position for a queer criminologist that might allow for the possibility of engaging with otherwise injurious institutions and making them mean different things and reformulating them in some form or another. And after all, in the absence of long-term queer political goals of abolition of criminal justice institutions, then a short-term goal like that, so as to ensure that they can foster queer lives as much as possible, is necessary, and I'd also argue ethical to some extent. So in effect, both positions try to implement conditions under which some queer lives would become or remain livable. If we took one or the other position to be more appropriate, then I'd argue that we can see that there are other queer lives that are made less possible or limited in some form or another. Again, I'm not suggesting that all of those forms are equal and it's going to have the same effect on everyone. So I'd suggest that we can only, as queer criminologists, we can only work with those tensions and find ways in which to stop those positions talking past each other. Because if there was something that really characterised the debates about this issue, it was the fact that both sides, and I do realise I'm sort of binarising these sides, but both positions never really engage with the other and the other's concerns effectively. So as I said, the people who supported the party never really considered or never really acknowledged to any significant extent the politics of kink and BDSM. At the same time, the people who supported the party didn't actually engage with the structural issues of structural violence and marginalisation that the protesters were raising. They simply reinterpreted it all as an individualised kind of restriction on individual freedoms. So they ended up speaking across purposes, which was problematic. So we can consider whether investing in criminal justice institutions has any queer value, whether it is more important to subversively queer such institutions. I think we can examine the multiple ways in which real criminal justice institutions might be thought about politically, and we can explore the range of methods through which queer lives might be fostered in the criminal justice context. In effect, what I'd argue is that queer criminological scholarship must be nothing other than an ethical project devoted to ensuring that queer lives can become and remain livable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matthew. I think we have time for a couple of questions. If you can stay with us while we do that. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Matthew, it's John. You can't see me, I don't think.
I might move.
Can you hear me?
Move the camera.
Hi, Matthew.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it troubled me a little bit as well, your troubling of the ethics between the two positions, and reminded me of a debate that's happening, well, has just concluded at the minute around Glasgow Pride and around the admission of drag queens to perform, because Glasgow Pride took a decision a few weeks ago to ban drag queens because it was seen as being oppressive to the trans community, and after a barrage of complaints then allowed non-cisgender drag queens to perform, but eventually they admitted that they admitted wrongness, I suppose, in some sense. But in this case, kind of the positions did speak to each other and came to kind of some kind of an understanding of each other. And I can't remember where I'm going with this, but I just wonder about that misinterpretation of kink. And I mean, you know, we have a misunderstanding of fetish. I mean, we have fetishes around, you know, doctors and nurses and teachers and students, and lots of people are abused and were abused in educational and health environments as well. And I just find it, but again, and that kind of comment around political tone deafness confirming stereotypes, I find quite troubling, because it's, so what if they do confirm stereotypes? We don't care about the stereotypes. I don't know, I just found it really interesting, your paper, so thanks very much.
Oh, thank you. I'll have to have a look up at the Glasgow Pride issue that you mentioned, because I hadn't actually heard about that at all. So you said that was just a recent.
Yeah,
recently.
They retracted their decision just yesterday or the day before.
Okay.
So yeah, they made a decision a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, but it was around that argument that we need safe space for trans people, and then by disengaging people who do drag. So I don't know.
I think on the other point that you were making, I find that, I mean, I'm also baffled by, it's understandable the concern that people have about criminal justice institutions or criminal justice motifs and the, I suppose, the inequalities, the inequities of which groups are most marginalised by that kind of violence and those kinds of issues. So I don't know whether that exists to the same extent and in the same in the context, the other context that you mentioned. But yeah, it is. I'm not exactly sure how one gets around the speaking at cross purposes and misunderstanding about how you actually take up and utilise and re-signify what are effectively quite injurious symbols and tropes and what have you. And I think one thing that people seem to have difficulty with is that the register of the party is fantasy, whereas the criminal justice system is reality. And I think that gets how you deal with problematic things from reality in a fantasy world. That's, yeah, I have no idea how to deal with that or anything. And it's interesting, one of the, just on that point as well, one of the critiques that I haven't included in the paper, but that I came across in doing this, was that the company that runs these parties has a number of set themes that they have, and they've previously run something to do with fashion and something to do with casinos as well, and airlines as themes for their parties. And people were saying, well, why is this criminal justice system such a big problem when, you could make a similar argument about gambling and the destruction that's caused by gambling from but by trivialising that as a party thing as well. So there is this sort of real misunderstanding, I suppose, within the community about just the kinds of marginalisation, the kinds of problems that the criminal justice institution itself or institutions produce in people's lives as well.
Okay, thank you. Should we just take one more?
Hey, I'm Masha Neufeld, and yeah, just to continue that one, my question would be in how far, or do you consider the whole concept and debate on privilege within that queer criminology framework? Because as John, I don't really think that this is a misunderstanding. I really think that those people who were against the party, that they were very aware of that whole concept of, you know, like subversion of king and like, I don't know, like empowerment and stuff. But I also think that they were very aware of the fact that within that framework, it won't work, because, like, you know, if you have $75 and you can afford the party, then you have the privilege to not care whether it's hurtful or whatever. So I think privilege is to not see things than to not care because you can afford it. So I think, like, this is, I'm just like, I don't know, maybe I'm challenging your idea on that misunderstanding, because I don't think it's a misunderstanding. I think it's structural bullshit.
Oh, yeah.
Like
yeah.
racism
I think
whatever.
I do take your point, absolutely, and I think it just seems, it struck me as really, I can fully understand for those who are protesting the party and those organisations that are encountering this marginalisation every day and this injustice every day. I can fully understand why they wouldn't want to engage. I mean, I'm sure, even in that original letter, as I pointed out, they acknowledged the fact that this could be read as them trying to shame people in a particular way. So yes, I do fully agree that they are aware of that. And on the other side, there are people who I'm sure were just completely dismissive of the importance of any of those kinds of protests. So there were people who were who really just demonstrated that privilege, just, you know, entirely. One example, if you search for on queerty.com, the queer news site, for this issue, there is a series of articles about the protest that is basically just, the author is just rolling their eyes at the idea that people would protest this kind of party. And it's actually horrendous to see that kind of stuff on a queer news site. So yes, I think there are those extremes in terms of that privilege, but I think there's also this this range of views in the middle, where I think there is more room for moving. And I think that people might be more ready to acknowledge that this is actually much more complex than they sort of expected. And that those are only kind of conversations that are starting to be had within queer criminology itself, and queer criminologists pointing to the importance of thinking intersectionally and thinking about issues of privilege and what have you as well. So it's sort of a rambling answer to that question. I'm sorry, it's like it's past midnight here, so you'll have to excuse me there. But I do take your point about just bullshit privilege, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we do need to move on to our next speaker now, but can we just thank Matthew again for joining us after midnight?